The late 19th century. America was transitioning from a largely agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse. But this rapid progress came at a cost. The rise of monopolies was the result of a confluence of factors. Railroads facilitated the consolidation of industries. Shrewd businessmen formed trusts to control multiple companies. They engaged in predatory pricing and bought out competitors. The public grew increasingly disillusioned. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was the answer. The late 19th century saw the rise of industrial giants. Andrew Carnegie dominated the steel industry with vertical integration. John D. Rockefeller controlled the oil market through Standard Oil. These industrialists justified their tactics with social Darwinism. For many Americans, these arguments rang hollow. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil exemplified the rise of monopolies. He secured preferential shipping rates and used predatory pricing. Smaller oil producers were forced to sell out. Standard Oil controlled every aspect of the oil industry. Railroad tycoons like Cornelius Vanderbilt amassed fortunes. Farmers faced discriminatory freight rates. Unfair pricing practices sparked widespread outrage. The railroad's power became a source of resentment. The unchecked power of monopolies did not go unchallenged. Farmers and labor unions demanded government regulation. Muckraking journalists exposed predatory practices. The public's demand for reform grew. By the late 1880s, the clamor for action against monopolies reached a fever pitch. Senator John Sherman emerged as a leading voice for reform. He crafted the Sherman Antitrust Act to outlaw anti-competitive practices. Sherman tirelessly advocated for his legislation. The debate over the Sherman Antitrust Act was fierce. Despite opposition, the act passed with bipartisan support. It aimed to prohibit anti-competitive practices and monopolies. The act marked a new era of government regulation. The Sherman Antitrust Act marked a turning point. It established a precedent for government intervention. The act empowered the federal government to investigate anti-competitive practices. Despite early challenges, it laid the groundwork for future antitrust laws. The Sherman Antitrust Act faced immediate challenges. The Supreme Court's narrow interpretation limited its reach. President Theodore Roosevelt used the act to challenge powerful trusts. Roosevelt's actions demonstrated the act's potential effectiveness. The Sherman Antitrust Act faced enforcement challenges. Its vague language created uncertainty. The Department of Justice lacked resources for effective enforcement. Political pushback further limited the act's impact. The interpretation and application of the Sherman Antitrust Act ultimately fell to the courts, and the early rulings were far from consistent. The Supreme Court, tasked with defining the scope and reach of the act, issued a series of decisions that reflected the ongoing debate over the role of government in regulating business. These early rulings, often narrow in their interpretation, revealed the challenges of applying broad legal principles to complex economic realities. One of the most consequential early cases was United States v. E.C. Knight Company in 1895, which dealt a significant blow to the Act's perceived power. The case involved the American Sugar Refining Company, which had acquired control of over 98% of the nation's sugar refining capacity. The government argued that this consolidation violated the Sherman Act by creating a monopoly. However, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of E.C. Knight, drawing a distinction between manufacturing and commerce, and holding that the Sherman Act applied only to restraints on interstate commerce, not to manufacturing. This narrow interpretation effectively exempted many monopolies from the Act's reach, as long as they confined their activities to production, rather than direct engagement in interstate trade. The E.C. Knight decision sent shockwaves through the legal and business communities. signaling that the Sherman Act was not the silver bullet that many had hoped for. The ruling emboldened some businesses to pursue mergers and acquisitions, believing they could operate with greater impunity. It also highlighted the need for more precise language in antitrust legislation to address the complexities of a rapidly evolving industrial economy. Undeterred by the Sherman Act's existence, businesses and their legal minds sought ways to circumvent its provisions. The Act's broad language and the lack of a dedicated enforcement agency created opportunities for creative maneuvering. Companies, driven by the pursuit of profit and determined to maintain their dominance, devised various strategies to operate outside the Act's perceived boundaries. One common tactic was the use of holding companies. Instead of directly merging with competitors, companies would create a separate entity, a holding company, that would acquire the stock of other companies in the same industry. This allowed the holding company to control the actions of the supposedly independent companies without technically violating the Sherman Act's prohibition on mergers that restrained trade. Another strategy involved the use of informal agreements or gentlemen's agreements. Recognizing that formal contracts could attract legal scrutiny, companies would engage in unspoken agreements to fix prices, divide markets, or otherwise limit competition. These informal arrangements, difficult to prove in court, allowed companies to maintain the appearance of a competitive market while reaping the benefits of collusion. Businesses also exploited the Act's focus on interstate commerce. The E.C. Knight decision had established that the Sherman Act did not apply to manufacturing, so some companies attempted to structure their operations to appear primarily intrastate, even if their products ultimately flowed into interstate commerce. This strategy, while not always successful, further illustrated the challenges of applying a law designed for a simpler era to the complexities of a modern industrial economy. The early years of the Sherman Antitrust Act were marked by uncertainty. The law's vague language and lack of enforcement created doubts. The public began to question its impact. Newspapers highlighted the continued dominance of monopolies. The Sherman Act, despite its limitations, sparked a national conversation about corporations. The battle against monopolies was far from over. As the 20th century dawned, a new era of reform was sweeping the nation. The excesses of the Gilded Age, the unchecked power of monopolies, and the growing disparity between the rich and the poor had fueled a progressive movement determined to address these injustices. The Sherman Antitrust Act, once viewed with skepticism and hampered by weak enforcement, found renewed vigor in this climate of reform. Theodore Roosevelt, assuming the presidency in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley, embraced the mantle of the trust buster. Roosevelt, a charismatic leader with a deep distrust of concentrated power, believed that the government had a moral obligation to regulate big business and ensure a fair and competitive marketplace. He saw the Sherman Act as a powerful tool to achieve these goals. Roosevelt's administration, unlike its predecessors, vigorously pursued antitrust enforcement, initiating over 40 lawsuits against companies deemed to be operating in restraint of trade. While Roosevelt recognized the benefits of large corporations, he believed that their power must be balanced by government oversight to prevent abuses and protect the public interest. One of Roosevelt's most ambitious targets was Standard Oil, the sprawling oil empire built by John D. Rockefeller. Standard Oil, by the early 1900s, controlled over 90% of the American oil refining market, giving it near absolute control over prices and distribution. Roosevelt, convinced that Standard Oil had used its vast power to stifle competition and harm consumers, directed his Attorney General, Philander C. Knox, to initiate legal proceedings against the company under the Sherman Act. The U.S. government filed its landmark antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil in 1906, alleging illegal practices to monopolize the oil industry. The case rested on a mountain of evidence, detailing Standard Oil's ruthless tactics to crush competition. Central were Standard Oil's preferential agreements with railroads, securing lower shipping rates to undercut competitors. These deals, the government argued, were an illegal restraint of trade. Standard Oil's predatory pricing strategies forced smaller competitors out of business. Once monopolized, they raised prices to recoup losses. This violated the Sherman Act's prohibition on monopolization. The case captured the nation's attention, pitting the federal government against one of the wealthiest corporations. Section 3. a nation divided. The legal battle between the United States government and Standard Oil captivated the nation, igniting a fierce debate about corporate power, government regulation, and the future of American capitalism. The case exposed deep divisions within American society, reflecting differing views on the role of government in the economy and the balance between individual liberty and the common good. Supporters of the government's case, including many farmers, small business owners, and labor leaders, hailed the lawsuit as a long overdue reckoning for corporate greed and abuse. They argued that Standard Oil's monopolistic practices stifled competition, stifled innovation, and harmed consumers by driving up prices and limiting choices. They saw the lawsuit as a crucial step towards restoring fairness to the marketplace and ensuring a level playing field for all businesses. Opponents of the government's case, primarily wealthy industrialists, financiers, and their allies in the press, argued that the lawsuit was an unwarranted attack on successful businesses and a dangerous expansion of government power. They argued that Standard Oil's success was a testament to its efficiency and innovation, not the result of illegal practices. They warned that breaking up the company would harm the economy, discourage investment, and stifle innovation. The debate surrounding the Standard Oil case reflected a fundamental tension in American life: the balance between individual ambition and the common good. The case forced Americans to confront the question of whether the pursuit of wealth and corporate power should be subject to government regulation to protect the interests of consumers, workers, and the broader economy. Section 4. A landmark decision. On May 15, 1911, the United States Supreme Court issued its landmark ruling in the case of Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus United States. The court found Standard Oil guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, marking a turning point in American antitrust law. The decision sent shockwaves through the business world. The court ordered Standard Oil to be broken up into 34 separate companies to restore competition. This precedent demonstrated the government's willingness to dismantle monopolies and reshape industries. Section 1. A legacy of reform. The Sherman Antitrust Act, born amidst the Gilded Age, left an indelible mark on American business and law. It rebuked monopolies, asserting the government's duty to protect competition and the public interest. The act set in motion reforms that reshaped American capitalism. It established that economic power must be exercised within the bounds of the law. The act paved the way for agencies like the Federal Trade Commission to prevent anti-competitive practices. Its legacy remains vital in an era of globalization and technological disruption. Section 2. The Sherman Act in the modern age. Over a century after its passage, the Sherman Antitrust Act continues to shape American business, its principles as relevant as ever in an age of global commerce and technological disruption. The rise of tech companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook has reignited the debate over the role of antitrust law in the 21st century. Critics argue that these companies stifle competition and wield undue influence over information and commerce. The application of the Sherman Act to tech companies presents unique challenges. The Act's enduring legacy lies in its ability to adapt to changing economic circumstances, providing a framework for government intervention to prevent new monopolies.